The loaf on the inspector's scale is no larger than a clenched fist. It is supposed to sell for 1 farthing. That has not changed. What has changed is everything required to make it. Outside your bakehouse, rain runs through the London street. Damp firewood smokes beneath the oven. A merchant offers 1/4 of wheat for 20 shillings, 4 times the price recorded 2 years earlier, and wants cash or security against your property. The city will not allow you to solve this in the obvious modern way. You cannot simply declare that tomorrow's farthing loaf will cost a penny. Under the Assize of Bread, the coin price remains familiar. Instead, the legal loaf becomes smaller as wheat becomes dearer. The table tells the customer how little bread a farthing now buys, and tells the inspector exactly what your loaf must weigh. Buy the wheat, and almost every coin in the business disappears before the first batch is sold. Refuse, and the oven goes cold, while rent, wages, hunger, and debt continue. Make the loaf even slightly too light, and the loss moves from your ledger to the courtroom. The question is not whether London still needs bread. It is whether a bakery can survive when demand is desperate, raw material is scarce, and the law controls the only price your customers understand. Return to London in 1313. The city may contain 80,000 people or more, supplied through roads, rivers, coastal shipping, markets, mills, and credit. Grain provides a dominant share of ordinary calories. London must be fed every day. Our baker is a composite master, reconstructed from London regulations, court records, urban food studies, and the Assize's statutory costs. He may own or lease the bakehouse. His is a household craft economy, family labour, servants, apprentices or boys, merchant credit, municipal inspection, and a reputation that can be damaged in public. In a normal year, this looks like a remarkably defensive business. People may postpone cloth, tools, ale, or meat. They cannot postpone calories for long. The product moves quickly. The city recognizes standard coin-denomination loaves. The assize even includes allowances intended to cover the baker's fuel, labour, salt, bolting cloth, and gain. The apparent safety of the business comes from regulation. Customers know what a farthing or penny will buy. Officials can punish short weight, and the baker is not supposed to be ruined merely because wheat prices move.
But the same system becomes dangerous when the harvest fails. The assize can alter the weight of bread. It cannot create sound grain, advance working capital, dry soaked wheat, restore a customer's wages, or force a merchant to extend credit. That is the central contradiction. The regulation appears to protect the bakery because it adjusts the loaf to the grain price, yet it leaves the baker dependent on the things the table does not regulate: access to grain, access to cash, usable flour, labour, fuel, sales volume, and the timing of official enforcement. By the end, we can identify what the bakery controlled, how a normal batch produced revenue, and which bakers could survive the Great Famine of 1315 to 1317. We can decide whether the farthing loaf preserved the business or concealed its collapse. The largest visible asset is the oven. It is also the least movable. A bakehouse requires a hearth and flue, fuel space, grain or flour storage, a kneading area, oven peels, trays, scales, official weights, sieves or bolting cloth, and containers protected from damp, rats, and theft. Tools can be sold. The oven cannot be moved when rent rises or supply shifts. Legal position matters as much as masonry. London bakers were a recognized craft by the 12th century, and authorities treated bread as a public concern. This was not a modern licensing system, but neither was baking unrestricted. Training, status, household resources, relationships, and the ability to withstand scrutiny all mattered. The bakery might buy grain and arrange milling, or buy meal from intermediaries. Either way, the business stands between agricultural supply and urban retail.
The mill takes value through toll or service. Carriers must be paid. Grain must be moved, measured, stored, cleaned, ground, sifted, mixed, fermented, shaped, baked, cooled, and sold before staling or spoilage destroys its value. The Assize lists allowances associated with 3 servants and 2 boys, plus kneading, candles, salt, fuel, and bolting cloth. This does not prove every bakehouse employed 5 workers. It shows that lawmakers understood bread as a chain of labor and material costs. Small shops could rely on household labor. Larger ones might work through the night. Medieval London did not consume one uniform brown loaf. Regulations distinguished fine wastel, cocket, whole wheat, and coarser breads. Fine flour left more bran. Coarser bread retained more grain and could produce more saleable food, although legal formulas and customer expectations still constrained the choice. Then comes the first accounting surprise. When an assize table says that a farthing wastel loaf should weigh 27 shillings and 2.5 pence, those shillings and pence are not its retail price. They are units of troy weight. At a wheat price of 5 shillings per quarter, that legal farthing loaf was roughly half a kilogram. If wheat rose to 20 shillings per quarter, the corresponding loaf fell to about 127 grams. The money price remains 1 farthing. The physical price changes dramatically. This is why the system cannot be described accurately as a crude order to sell a large loaf below cost. The assize was designed to reduce the loaf's weight as grain became dearer. It also granted the baker a defined gain, 4 pence in the surviving national formulation, along with bran, a small quantity of additional bread, and cost allowances. But gain here is a regulatory margin inside a model calculation. It is not an audited annual profit after rent, debt, family consumption, bad batches, repairs, theft, or fines. The baker therefore owns less economic freedom than the oven suggests. He controls workmanship, purchasing choices, product mix within the rules, staffing, credit relationships, and the decision to continue baking. He does not control the harvest, the market price of wheat, the legal relationship between that price and loaf weight, or the inspector's scale. Leaving is costly. Rent and debts continue, tools sell badly in a general crisis, and workers and customers disperse. The bakery's value depends on operating, but operation requires cash before it produces bread. To understand the trap, begin with 1 quarter of wheat in a normal year. A quarter is a bulk grain measure, not a quarter of a modern bag. Its exact physical weight varied with the grain and local measurement, so the safest reconstruction follows the medieval calculation rather than pretending to know the precise number of modern loaves. In the price evidence used by contemporaries and later historians, 5 shillings for a quarter of wheat represents an ordinary pre-famine comparison point. That is 60 pence paid before the batch earns anything. The grain does not move directly from merchant to customer.
Milling, transport, handling, sifting, salt, fuel, light, labor, storage, and losses stand between purchase and sale. The assize attempted to recognize these costs. Its pennies assigned to servants, boys, wood, candles, kneading, salt, and cloth look tiny to a modern reader, but the important point is structural. The official formula assumed that grain cost was only the largest line, not the only one. Once flour is ready, the bakery shapes different grades and denominations. Farthing loaves serve the smallest purchase. Halfpenny and penny loaves create larger transactions. Fine bread reaches wealthier households, coarser bread those seeking quantity. Sales may be direct or through women who resold bread. Bran and the assize's small allowance of additional bread add secondary value. A normal year rewards rhythm. Grain arrives, the oven runs full, bread leaves quickly, and one sequence helps finance the next. Seasonal variation still matters. After harvest, grain may be more available and cheaper. Later in the year, storage losses and tightening supply can raise the purchase cost. A prudent master therefore holds some reserve without tying up so much cash that rent and wages become impossible. That turnover can make a thin margin look substantial.
If each batch contributes only a modest gain, many batches over a year may support the household, pay rent, replace tools, and preserve enough credit to continue. Demand is broad, predictable, and frequent. Unlike a luxury craftsman waiting for one rich patron, the baker can sell to hundreds of ordinary buyers. Yet revenue, profit, and cash are three different things. Revenue is the stream of farthings, halfpennies, and pennies received after bread is sold. Regulatory gain is the margin the assize intends to leave after certain recognized costs. Actual profit is what remains after every real cost, including those the formula estimates badly or ignores. Cash is what the baker has at the moment the merchant demands payment. A bakery can be profitable over a sequence of batches and still fail on the morning it cannot finance the next quarter of grain. In the good year, merchant credit conceals this weakness. A known baker with regular turnover may buy on terms, borrow within personal networks, delay some payments, or use household reserves. The gap between purchasing grain and selling bread is short enough to seem manageable. The oven itself, the lease, or the master's reputation may support confidence even without a formal banking system, but the apparent stability rests on several assumptions. Grain of reasonable quality must be available. The official wheat price used for the assize must correspond closely enough to the baker's actual purchase price. Flour yield must be normal. The oven must remain busy enough to use fuel efficiently. Customers must still possess small coins. Workers must be fed and capable of labor. Inspectors must judge the batch according to a current and correctly proclaimed standard. Small errors are absorbable. A few heavy or burned loaves, some damp flour, or a delayed payment bridged by yesterday's cash. The business looks secure because no single weakness is fatal, while all the others remain stable. The harvest failure removes them together. At first glance, the bakery seems to sell bread. Economically, it performs a more specific operation. It converts a large, expensive, irregularly supplied agricultural asset into thousands of standardized urban cash transactions. The oven matters, but the conversion depends on timing. Grain must be purchased in bulk before bread can be sold in fragments. This is the hidden business model. Consider the assize at 5 shillings per quarter and again at 20 shillings. The wheat price has multiplied by 4. The legal weight of the farthing wastel loaf falls to roughly 1/4 of its former size. From the same quantity of grain, the baker can therefore produce many more farthing loaves. If every loaf is sold and the conversion works as assumed, total nominal receipts rise broadly with the grain price. On paper, the formula still functions. That overturns the simplest version of the story. The baker is not necessarily ordered to buy wheat at 4 times the cost and sell exactly the same amount of bread for the same total revenue. The law changes the amount of bread attached to each coin. In principle, it can preserve the grain-cost relationship, but it does not preserve the business. To purchase the quarter, the baker still needs 20 shillings now instead of 5. The additional farthings arrive later, one tiny loaf at a time. Working capital must multiply before revenue can multiply. A merchant who once risked 5 shillings on the baker's promise is now asked to risk 20 during a famine when default is becoming common and the collateral itself may be losing value. The production process also becomes less efficient. Quarter-sized loaves mean more pieces to divide, weigh, shape, count, handle, cool, inspect, and sell. Some costs follow the amount of grain, others follow the number of transactions or oven loads. The statutory table can adjust weights, but it cannot guarantee that labor and fuel costs fall in the same proportion. Adjustment also depends on administration. Authorities must establish a market price and proclaim the corresponding legal weight. Grain purchases do not necessarily occur at one uniform price, and a baker buying urgently or in a small lot may pay more than the figure underlying the table. Regulation is precise on parchment, but the market moves between proclamations. Nor can customers eat nominal revenue. A laborer who spends 1 farthing receives perhaps a quarter of the former bread. To maintain calories, the household needs 4 times as many coins. During a crisis of falling real wages, that is impossible for many people. Demand for bread remains intense in a biological sense, but effective demand, the ability to pay for enough bread, collapses. The queue outside the bakehouse can therefore grow while the business becomes less solvent. The bakery's true dependency is not a fixed retail price. It is the continuous availability of grain finance, supported by the belief that the baker can turn one costly bulk purchase into enough legal small sales before debt, spoilage, labor, and hunger consume the proceeds. The law regulates the ratio between wheat and loaf weight. It does not regulate the time between cash going out and cash coming back. In 1315, time becomes the most expensive ingredient in the bakery. The first blow arrives in the fields. Persistent cold and rain damaged the harvest of 1315 across much of northern Europe. English chroniclers describe grain that fails to ripen, difficult drying, fodder shortages, and extraordinary prices. Wet conditions continue, the next harvest is also poor, and scarcity extends into 1316 and 1317. For the baker, the first visible change is the merchant's price. A chronicler at St. Albans compared wheat at 5 shillings per quarter in 1313 with 20 shillings during the famine. Other English price evidence reaches even higher levels, around 28 shillings and 6 pence in 1315. These are not precise quotations for every London transaction. They establish the scale of the shock. Wheat can cost 4, 5, or more times its earlier level. The second change is credit. The shortage also changes transport. Grain that would normally reach London through several routes becomes worth diverting toward whichever market pays best or offers the safest settlement. Carriers, merchants, and millers face their own shortages of fodder, labor, and working capital. A cargo may exist somewhere in England and still be economically unavailable to a small baker who cannot finance its movement or purchase it in the required quantity. At 5 shillings, a seller may tolerate a short delay. At 20, the same quarter ties up 4 times as much money, while replacement stock is uncertain. Credit terms shorten. A baker without grain must find more cash, pledge assets, buy less, or stop. Buying less protects cash but damages oven economics. A partial load wastes fuel. Smaller deliveries raise handling costs. And rent, household consumption, maintenance, and debt do not shrink with output. Then the quality of the grain deteriorates. The legal table assumes grain with predictable yield. Wet or badly stored wheat produces less useful flour, demands drying or sorting, and spoils before reaching the trough. Contemporary accounts describe weak, unsatisfying bread. The Assize can recognize price, not baking quality. If the proclaimed price differs from the baker's purchase cost, or poor yield consumes part of the lot, the legal loaf can still be heavier than his real economics permit. The temptation is to shave weight or disguise inferior material. The city's response makes that temptation more dangerous. The Assize is not merely consumer protection, it is also a public order mechanism. Bread is visible, frequently purchased, and politically sensitive. If the loaf seems too small or too dark, anger falls on the person behind the counter, even when the harvest, merchant, mill, and official table created the result. The baker becomes the most accessible face of a supply crisis he does not control. Scarcity increases the incentive to cheat, so officials inspect weight and quality. Repeated violations can bring escalating amercements, public punishment, imprisonment, or suspension. One fine can remove the next grain payment and damage credit. The third change is the customer. Londoners still need bread, but have less capacity to buy it. Grain inflation cuts real wages. Families sell possessions, substitute cheaper grains, and reduce meals. A contemporary account claimed that 4 pence of coarse bread might not satisfy an ordinary man for a day. The familiar coin buys far fewer calories. The baker shifts toward coarser products and small denominations. Poor buyers crowd toward the cheapest legal options, requiring more transactions and creating more opportunities for error, theft, disputes, and unsold bread. Then demand damages labour. Bakers, servants, carriers, and mill workers must eat. Money wages no longer sustain them. Raise compensation, and costs rise. Refuse, and labour weakens, leaves, or consumes sale stock. Feeding the workforce becomes a production expense. The fourth change is duration. Manorial evidence from the wider English crisis records severe output losses, with some yields falling by roughly a third and others by more than half. London's exact supply mix cannot be reconstructed batch by batch, but a shortage of that order cannot be repaired by one merchant finding a better road. It removes surplus across the network and forces buyers to compete for seed grain, food grain, and animal feed at the same time. A short spike can be bridged, successive failures cannot. By 1316, temporary working capital debt becomes a claim against the bakehouse, and the creditor controls the timing of survival. Government restricts exports, encourages imports, and reinforces market rules. A 1315 price ordinance targeted livestock, poultry, and eggs, not wheat, and was revoked after failing against scarcity. None of this guarantees sound grain at the bakehouse. The crisis reaches even royal travel. At St Albans in August 1315, a chronicler reported difficulty finding bread for the king's household. That episode does not prove London had no bread. It reveals that status and money could not instantly overcome disrupted supply. Market failure compounds physical scarcity. Some owners with grain delay sale in expectation of higher prices. Others protect household, estate, or seed requirements. Such behavior may be rational individually while worsening availability collectively. The city can punish false measure and regulate the loaf, but it cannot make every holder release grain on terms a small baker can afford. When conditions ease, the problem is a damaged balance sheet. Reserves are eaten, credit withdrawn, tools sold, workers lost, and fines outstanding. The oven survives physically, while the system that heats it is stripped away. The harvest shock has become an ownership crisis.
The master has three defensible choices. None restores the good year. The first is to keep buying wheat and obey the Assize. This protects legal standing and continuity, but relies on rapid turnover to recover a much larger grain payment. It saves the operating business and risks the owner's liquidity. One slow batch, poor yield, fine, or repayment demand can break the chain. It favors a cash-rich owner and punishes an indebted tenant. The second choice is to alter the mix. Coarser bread retains more grain and serves customers priced out of fine wheat bread. The master can reduce wastage and concentrate on fast-moving legal grades. He might also reserve the finest flour for buyers who can still pay larger denominations, using the remainder for more extractive bread. This is not modern price discrimination, but it is a way to match scarce raw material to customers with different purchasing power. This protects yield but creates risk. Other grains are scarce, regulations distinguish qualities, and legitimate substitution may look like adulteration. Poor customers generate intense need but little cash. Flexibility moves the pressure, it does not remove it. The third choice is contraction. Heat the oven less often, release workers, or close rather than pledge the house. This avoids the worst purchase but may destroy the enterprise. Rent continues, labor and customers disperse, credit disappears, and restarting requires the cash closure was meant to preserve. A partial closure may be safer than a complete one. Bake on fewer days, coordinate purchases with market arrivals, and avoid heating the oven for an uneconomic load. Yet customers who cannot predict when bread will appear may abandon the shop. Borrowing appears to solve everything. In a one-season crisis, it may. The poor harvest of 1316 turns bridge finance into a claim against the bakehouse, saving today's production by transferring tomorrow's assets to the creditor. At this point, the likely verdict seems grim for every baker. Then one variable changes the entire calculation. Who owned the grain before the rain began? Research on medieval English baking suggests that the bakers who could make substantial money were often not merely processors. Some also dealt in corn. That distinction becomes decisive in 1315. A small master buying weekly faces famine price as cost. A baker or corn dealer with dry inventory experiences it as asset appreciation. Grain purchased for 5 or 6 shillings can support bread calculated against 20 or be sold directly. The inventory-rich baker already owns the grain. He need not raise 4 times the working capital. He can sell part of the stock to finance labor and fuel and keep baking without borrowing at the peak. More importantly, he possesses optionality. He can choose whether the next unit of grain is more valuable as raw stock, fine bread, coarse bread, or security for credit. The cash-poor baker has no such choice. He must accept the merchant's terms before making any product decision. This is the second wind, but it is not a rescue for the trade as a whole. It divides the trade. The crisis rewards possession of the scarce input more than skill at transforming it. The best baker in London can fail without grain finance. A mediocre but well-stocked operator can survive and perhaps profit because the valuable asset is no longer the oven, it is the grain behind the locked door. Stock carries danger, damp, theft, intervention, and hostility toward withholding food. A rational survivor sells enough to finance baking, favors reliable products, restricts weak credit, and preserves a reserve. The strongest countermeasure is balance. Enough inventory to avoid the peak, enough cash to operate, enough baking to preserve the trade, and enough reserve to survive one bad batch. Only resource-rich owners can maintain it. The famine does not test every bakery equally. It reveals which bakeries were already dependent on tomorrow's credit. There is no surviving annual profit and loss statement for a representative London bakery in 1315. A precise verdict in pounds would be false accuracy. A scenario verdict is stronger. In the best defensible case, the master securely holds the bakehouse, carries little debt, owns dry grain, and has dependable milling and transport contacts. Because the assize reduces loaf weight as wheat rises, the raw grain calculation does not force a loss on every loaf. Existing stock gains value, and careful sales can fund fuel and essential labor. Such a baker might remain nominally profitable, although scarcity and inventory ownership create the gain. Spoilage, political pressure, and another failed harvest remain threats. In the likely case, a modest master leases premises, buys frequently, and holds little cash. At 5 shillings per quarter, the cycle is manageable. At 20, the same purchase requires 4 times the money before sale. The loaf shrinks, but rent, household needs, bad grain, labor subsistence, and debt do not. Borrowing and cheaper bread preserve turnover by consuming resilience. Nominal accounts may still show money coming through the shop. In real terms, however, that money buys less food, less fuel, and less replacement grain. A positive margin measured in pence can coexist with a declining household and a shrinking productive base. Medieval survival accounting is therefore easy to misread. The master may appear solvent only because his family absorbs costs that the ledger never records. This bakery may survive the first failure without meaningful profit. The owner eats less, uses unpriced family labor, delays repairs, sells possessions, and rolls debt forward. By the second failure, business capital and household food merge. Continued operation liquidates the owner's reserves through bread. In the failure case, the baker has no stock, weak credit, and an approaching payment. He buys near the peak, cannot fill the oven efficiently, loses yield to poor grain, and sees the statutory gain erased by spoilage or fines. Borrowing pledges the fixed asset. Closure destroys turnover. London still wants bread, but he cannot buy the next input before earlier obligations mature. The typical small operator has a better chance of remaining useful than profitable. Contraction, debt, substitution, and unpaid household labor may preserve the trade temporarily.
Without grain, cash, property, or strong credit, consecutive failures likely leave him poorer, indebted, closed, or dispossessed. This outcome is an economic reconstruction, but it is consistent with wider evidence that famine households liquidated assets to purchase food and meet credit obligations. The decisive asset is therefore not simply the oven. In the good year, the oven converts skill into turnover. In the famine, grain inventory and credit determine whether the oven can be used at all. Ownership of productive equipment matters only while the owner can command the input that gives it purpose. Who captures the gain? Those holding sound grain possess the strongest position. Surplus landholders, merchants, and bakers who also trade in corn. Creditors acquire claims over ovens, leases, and property. Consumers absorb the collapse in loaf size. Bakers absorb the gap between the official formula and wet grain. Hungry workers, delayed cash, and inspection. The farthing is not the trap.
The trap is that it looks unchanged, while the chain behind it demands more capital, credit, and risk. Return to the inspector scale. The tiny loaf may be perfectly legal. That does not make the bakery safe. The law has transferred scarcity into the customer's hands, while the empty purse belongs to the baker who had to finance it before selling it in pieces. He can raise total revenue only by selling far more small loaves. He can preserve the oven only with cash the regulation does not provide. He can obey every weight and still lose the business. In a normal year, the assize turns grain into trusted bread. In one bad year, it reveals who owned the grain, who controlled the credit, and who had enough time to wait. The loaf survived. The baker might not.